A journey of love and redemption. The cold night air clung to my skin as I gripped my son's tiny hand, our steps slow and measured as we approached the quiet suburban house. 4 years had passed since we had last been here. 4 years of struggles, of victories, of lonely nights and hopeful mornings. And now, after all this time, I was finally bringing our son to meet his father again. I had imagined this moment countless times. The scenarios played out in my mind like a reel of film. Would he be shocked? Would he embrace his child with open arms? Or would regret and shame keep him frozen in place? I tried to keep my expectations in check, but the truth was, I wanted him to see what he had missed. To see the beautiful, brilliant little boy who had grown without him. My son, oblivious to the tension in my heart, skipped beside me, his tiny face lit with innocent curiosity. "Mommy, are we almost there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sweetheart," I replied, squeezing his hand gently. "We're almost there." The house loomed ahead, familiar, yet foreign. My fingers hovered over the doorbell, hesitating. Would he even want to see us? Would he turn us away? The thought made my stomach churn, but I pushed it aside. My son deserved to know his father, even if it was just for one night. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the doorbell. The chime echoed through the silent night, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The door creaked open, revealing a man whose face I once knew better than my own. His eyes widened in disbelief as they flickered between me and the small child clutching my hand. "Hello, Jake," I said softly. He didn't answer right away. His gaze was locked onto our son, his lips parting slightly as if words failed him. He looked older, tired, a shadow of the man I had once loved. Finally, he spoke. Is that..." I nodded. "Yes, Jake, this is your son." A heavy silence fell between us, stretching endlessly. I watched the emotions play across his face. Shock, guilt, sadness. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, kneeling down until he was at eye level with our son. "Hi there," Jake said, his voice unsteady. I'm your dad." My son looked up at me, searching for reassurance. I nodded, encouraging him. Slowly, he turned back to Jake, his small voice filled with curiosity. "My dad?" Jake swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, buddy, I'm your dad. And His voice broke. He looked away, blinking rapidly. "I'm so sorry." I felt my throat tighten. This was only the beginning. I had prepared myself for a tough conversation, but seeing Jake like this, so overwhelmed, so vulnerable, made my own emotions threaten to spill over. "Can we come in?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated, then stepped aside. Yeah, please." As we walked into the house, I couldn't help but notice how little had changed. The same couch, the same old wooden coffee table, yet everything felt different, heavy with memories of what once was and what could have been. My son wandered into the living room, his eyes scanning the space curiously. Jake watched him like he was seeing a miracle unfold before his very eyes. How have you been?" he asked, his voice tentative. I sighed, sinking into the couch. "It hasn't been easy," I admitted, "but we've managed. He's an amazing kid, Jake. Smart, kind. You'd be so proud." Jake rubbed his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. "I should have been there," he murmured. "I miss so much." "Yes," I said, not sugarcoating the truth. You did. His head snapped up, pain flashing in his eyes. I didn't know how to face it, how to face you. I thought you'd be better off without me. That wasn't your choice to make, I replied, my tone firm but not unkind. He needed you, Jake. I needed you. Silence stretched between us again, thick with unspoken words. I wanted to be angry, to tell him off for all the nights I cried myself to sleep, for all the times I had to be both mother and father. But looking at him now, seeing the regret that etched deep into his features, I knew he had punished himself more than I ever could. My son climbed onto the couch beside me, resting his head on my lap. I stroked his hair gently, my heart aching with love for him. Jake watched us, his eyes glassy. Can I get to know him? I studied him, searching for sincerity. If you're serious about being in his life, Jake, it's not just for today. It's for good. He deserves stability. Jake nodded vigorously. I swear I'll do whatever it takes. I wanted to believe him. For my son's sake, I needed to believe him. Then we'll see, I said. For now, let's just take it one step at a time. Jake reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on our son's small shoulder. The little boy looked up at him. Then, in a moment that shattered every wall I had built around my heart, he smiled. And in that instant, hope bloomed where pain had once taken root. The dim glow of the living room lamp cast long shadows as Jake sat across from me, his gaze never leaving our son, who had dozed off on the couch between us. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic breathing of the little boy who had brought us back together, however fragile this reunion might be. Tell me everything I missed, Jake finally whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I hesitated for a moment, wondering where to even begin. How could I summarize 4 years of laughter, struggles, and milestones in just a few words? But as I looked into his pleading eyes, I knew I had to try. He loves dinosaurs, I started, a soft smile tugging at my lips. He can name almost all of them, even the hard ones. And he's obsessed with space. He says he wants to be an astronaut someday. Jake let out a shaky breath, a bittersweet smile forming. An astronaut, huh? That's incredible. I nodded. He's also the kindest little boy you'll ever meet. He shares his toys, always says please and thank you. He has the biggest heart, Jake, and he's so smart. Sometimes I don't even know where he gets it from. Jake chuckled lightly, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm himself. Probably from you. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I don't want to sugarcoat things, Jake. It hasn't been easy. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering how I was going to do it all alone. There were days I thought I wasn't strong enough. But I had to be. For him. Jake dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. I should have been there. I should have. You weren't, I interrupted, my voice gentle but firm. But you're here now. The question is, what are you going to do about it? He lifted his head, his eyes glistening. I want to be in his life. I want to make up for lost time. I know I can't change the past, but maybe I can help shape his future. I studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. It won't be easy, I warned. He doesn't really know you, and I need to be sure you won't walk away again. Jake straightened, determination settling in his features. I won't. I swear. Just tell me what I need to do. I let out a deep breath, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of this moment. Start small. Show up. Be consistent. If you say you're going to call, call. If you promise to visit, visit. He needs to know he can rely on you." Jake nodded fervently. "I can do that. I will do that." A long pause stretched between us before he whispered, "Do you think he'll forgive me?" I glanced at our sleeping son, my heart aching. Kids are forgiving, Jake. But trust? That takes time. He let my words sink in, then reached over hesitantly, brushing a strand of hair from our son's forehead. I want to earn that trust. For the first time in years, I allowed myself a sliver of hope. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the living room. I had barely slept, my mind racing with the possibilities of what was to come. Jake had stayed the night, sleeping on the couch, refusing to leave just yet. I wasn't sure what that meant, but for the first time in years, I wasn't alone in this. Our son stirred beside me, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. He blinked sleepily, his gaze landing on the unfamiliar figure sprawled out on the couch. He turned to me, his small face wrinkled in confusion. "Mommy, why is that man still here?" I swallowed, carefully choosing my words. "That man is your dad, sweetheart." He tilted his head, studying Jake with innocent curiosity. "My dad?" Jake sat up then, his expression a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Yeah, buddy, I'm your dad." There was a long pause, and then my son simply asked, "Where were you?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Jake let out a slow breath, his fingers interlocking as he leaned forward. "That's a fair question," he admitted. "And the truth is, I made mistakes, big ones. But I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped loving you." My son looked at me, searching for validation, and I nodded, silently urging him to listen. Jake continued, his voice softer now. "I want to be here for you now. I want to make up for the time I lost, if you'll let me." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a small voice, my son asked, "Will you play with me?" Jake's breath hitched. "Yeah, buddy, of course I will." A smile broke across my son's face, and he grabbed Jake's hand, pulling him toward his box of toys. Jake let himself be led, a cautious hope shining in his eyes. I watched as he sat down on the floor, listening intently as my son explained the rules of his game. It wasn't a grand moment. There were no dramatic speeches, no tearful hugs, just a father and son, playing together for the first time. But in that quiet exchange, something shifted. A door had been opened, and for the first time in years, I believed that maybe, just maybe, we could walk through it together. Hours passed, and the morning turned to afternoon. The once awkward air between Jake and our son slowly melted away. They built towers of blocks together, shared stories about dinosaurs, and laughed over silly jokes. With every small interaction, Jake seemed to grow more comfortable, and our son more trusting. At lunchtime, I watched Jake carefully place a peanut butter sandwich in front of our son. He hesitated, watching intently to see if the child would accept the small gesture. To my relief, our son took the sandwich, biting into it happily before offering Jake a tiny smile. Jake exhaled, a look of immense relief crossing his face. "He likes it," he whispered, as if in disbelief. I smiled. "Of course he does. He's just a kid, Jake. He just wants to feel loved." Jake looked down, ashamed. I wish I could go back and change everything. I wish I hadn't been so lost. I placed a hand over his. You can't change the past, but you can decide what happens next. Being here today means something. Just don't make promises you can't keep. Jake met my gaze with determination. I won't leave again. I swear. As evening approached, Jake reluctantly stood up. I should go, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. But can I come back tomorrow? Before I could answer, our son looked up, his small voice barely above a whisper. You promise? Jake knelt beside him, holding out his pinky. I promise. Our son wrapped his tiny pinky around Jake's, sealing the deal. My heart clenched, watching the scene unfold. This was just the beginning. There were no guarantees, no certainty about the future. But at that moment, for the first time in years, I dared to hope. The morning arrived with a crispness in the air, the sun breaking through the misty sky as I prepared breakfast. My son sat at the table, humming to himself while he colored in his book, his tiny hands clutching a crayon. It was the kind of ordinary morning that now carried an extraordinary weight. Today, Jake was coming back. The promise he had made last night had echoed in my mind, an unspoken hope swelling within me. I had been here before, trusting, hoping, and ultimately being left behind. But this time felt different. Maybe it was the way Jake had looked at our son, the way his voice had wavered with emotion, or the way he had sworn he wouldn't disappear again. A knock at the door made my heart jump. I turned to my son, who looked up with wide, expectant eyes. He's here, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I walked to the door, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled it open. Jake stood there, a small toy dinosaur clutched in his hand. His expression was uncertain, but his eyes held determination. I said I'd be back, he said quietly. I stepped aside, allowing him in. My son rushed forward, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the toy. Is that for me? Jake knelt down, holding it out to him. Yeah, buddy. I thought you might like it. My son took it with a wide grin, running back to his seat to examine his new treasure. I watched Jake watch him, his expression unreadable. You really came back, I said softly. Jake exhaled, his shoulders sinking slightly. I meant what I said. I want to be here. I don't know how to make up for lost time, but I'm willing to try. We sat down together, sharing coffee while our son continued playing. The conversation was slow at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters. But as the hours passed, something began to shift. Jake talked about his regrets, about the dark places he had been in that had kept him away. I listened, my own walls slowly lowering. Days turned into weeks, and Jake's visits became more frequent. He showed up to pick our son up from school, took him to the park, read him bedtime stories. And with each passing day, our son began to trust him more, their bond growing in ways I never thought possible. One evening, as I tucked our son into bed, he looked up at me with sleepy eyes. Mommy, is Daddy staying forever? I hesitated, knowing how fragile promises could be. I think he's trying, sweetheart. That night, as I sat on the couch with Jake, he turned to me, his expression earnest. I know I can't fix everything overnight, but I want to be the father he deserves. And I want to be here for you too. Tears welled in my eyes as I nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. A second chance, not just for Jake, but for all of us.